10,000 protesters took the streets of Hamburg in opposition to inequality, global capitalism, Trump, maybe their first time to do so. Last night's protest was called Welcome to Hell, lovingly titled. Protests were nonviolent, but also violent. Of course, this is a classic example. Police are blaming protesters, protesters blaming police, people say clashes. 20,000 police were deployed to Hamburg. Protesters were met with water cannons and tear gas. And so far, 83 people have been arrested, 17 have been detained. One activist told the New York Times, I thought this was good, "We were promised a festival of democracy, and what we're living through is a civil war on our streets." I think a lot of that was from Christoph Klein. I think there were protesters who went there to actually voice their opposition, others maybe to start a couple bonfires, but outside there were definitely people's voices being heard and saying that the G20 needs to represent the people of Europe, the people of the world.
Yeah. So this made me realize how different Europe is than the US. Now, of course, I already knew that, but it is like when you get into the details, it's fascinating. First of all, 111 officers injured and dozens of protesters as well. In the US, that is not how the proportion would go.
No.
If there were 2 officers injured, there would be hundreds of protesters injured and arrested. 17 detained when 111 officers were injured.
Yeah.
They were throwing firebombs, right? The protesters were, some. Again, there's black bloc and there's the guys who were ruining the peaceful protests. Most of the protesters were wonderfully peaceful, etc., but some were not and smashed windows, etc.
Sure.
Now, yes, the police had water cannons, pepper spray, billy clubs, they did have all that. But in the US, this is not how it would have gone down. And I know some right wingers celebrate that. They're like, oh yeah, we would have cracked their skulls and ended these democratic protests so quick, it would have made your head spin or your head crack. so
by design.
Yeah, and so that's a little different. And then the protesters, there's 160 different groups that are protesting, and they're all progressive, and they have socialists among them. They have all these different groups among them that, again, in America would have been characterized as like, oh my God, these guys, and look at them. And one of them threw a firebomb. That's it. They're all terrorists, etc. Meanwhile, the German government's like, no, we're trying to give them as much room as possible to protest, to show people like Turkey and Russia that you can have protests in a democracy and not arrest all of your political opponents, which is a wonderful idea and why I get more pissed at the people who cause violence inside the protests. And meanwhile, the protesters say, look, Hamburg is a very progressive city, and so this was an act of aggression by the government to even have the G20 meeting here.
Right.
Again, topsy-turvy. There is no, like in the American media, no one frames the government as the aggressors, right? And the protesters as the innocent ones. It's almost always the reverse. It's an act of aggression by the protesters when the government can obviously do whatever they want. It's almost as if the people in Germany can hold their government accountable, and so it's freaking me out.
Yeah. I just want to say also though that when you, I mean, it's like the conventions here, it's like any major protest that happens in the US. I think maybe the last one I saw that was an exception to this was the Women's March. But when you deploy 20,000 police officers, it is, I would say, already quite militarized, right? And so it's, as a peaceful protester, I've been there. You're staring down a riot cop, right? You're just trying to walk, and that it's almost like they're preparing for and / know that they want to, that the cops want to start something, And I think some of the images I've been seeing, and I know there are protesters who throw, whether you consider throwing a smoke bomb back, or excuse me, a tear gas canister back, an act of aggression, is up to you. But the images that struck me the most were seeing lines of nonviolent demonstrators sitting down and just water cannons, stuff that we saw at Standing Rock and things like this. And I think that the nonviolent protesters are one that kind of scram later on when Black Bloc comes out and starts getting a little more violent. But
and necessarily the numbers are always going to appear when you see the footage. Like even us, even the footage we just showed would give you the idea that there's a lot of water cannons, a lot of smoke, a lot of fire. And there's some of that, but we're talking about tens of thousands of people protesting theoretically. And so it's just the nature of the media that they're always going to make it seem far worse than it was. And in the American context, it'd be even worse. That's the only info you'd ever get about this protest, would be those attacks.
I just want to say that the thing that we need to remember about protests around global capitalism is that before you had the anti-globalists, before you had the Alex Joneses, before you had Donald Trump saying, I hate free trade, there were young people in the streets protesting the G20, the World Economic Forum, the World Trade Organization. The biggest one and the one that started it all was in Seattle in 1999, right? I just want to say that Donald Trump didn't start the anti-free trade movement. Alex Jones didn't start this anti-globalist, which is a super reactionary response to what 20 years ago almost, young people, labor union organizers, climate justice organizers back in the day were out there on the streets saying, hey, these economic free trade agreements do not benefit us. And guess what? They were met with repression then. What happened? 9/11. We've completely made a right turn, George Bush. So just to say, remember, look back in history that these protests have been going on. Europe has been a site of some of the strongest protests against free market capitalism just sort of running amok, not thinking about workers' rights, human rights. Let's remember that when Trump says he's the only one standing up against free trade, because the reality is otherwise.
And let's also remember that he said he would get rid of NAFTA. As far as I know, NAFTA is still in place.
Right.
So didn't deliver on that either. And lastly, I don't want to over-romanticize either the German government and their response or their protesters. So bad stuff has happened on both sides, no question about it. Just a little different context than what you would see here in the US, which leads me to my final point, which is that one of the groups, and you saw their sign there, is Alles für allen. That means everything for everyone. Now that's the kind of progressive movement in Germany and in Europe that's perfectly acceptable. They probably don't even know what I'm referring to. Everything for everyone. In America, they'd be like, liberal, socialist, communist, everything for everyone. No way, no. Everything for the very few who are super rich. Help us build independent media together. tytnetwork.com/join.